My best friend's son did something unexpected to me in the shower. My name is Evelyn. I've always thought of myself as a devoted wife and a caring mother. For years, I lived within the boundaries of what a good life should be, raising my son, supporting my husband, and keeping our home warm and inviting. But sometimes, even in the happiest routines, something begins to feel missing. I guess many women feel the same. The distance, the loneliness, even when you're married. It was on a bright, sunlit morning, while preparing for Ryan's birthday party, that my carefully constructed life began to unravel. Who could have imagined that a simple gesture of help would awaken feelings I had buried long ago, and that my best friend's son would do that to me in the shower? I stood on a wobbly ladder in the backyard, wrapping streamers around the pergola. The morning air was crisp, the kind that carried the promise of a perfect day. The sound of Ryan's laughter spilled from the kitchen, where he was talking animatedly with friends. I glanced toward the upstairs window, where Peter, my husband, was undoubtedly hunched over his laptop, immersed in his work. It wasn't that he didn't care. Peter had always been the provider, the steady presence in our family. But over the years, I had grown used to his absence, both physical and emotional. I carried most of the weight of our lives, and though I told myself I didn't mind, some days it felt unbearably heavy. The ladder shifted slightly beneath me, and I paused to steady myself. That's when I heard a voice behind me, deep and unexpectedly familiar. "Mrs. Hart, do you need a hand?" The sound startled me so much I almost lost my footing. I turned, clutching the ladder, and found myself looking down into the face of Dylan, Mara's son. It took a moment for me to recognize him. He had grown since I'd last seen him, taller, broader, his features sharper, and his presence more self-assured. For a moment, I couldn't speak. He was no longer the lanky boy who used to visit during school breaks. He was a man now, and his confidence was striking. It was in the way he stood, his posture relaxed yet commanding, as if he belonged wherever he was. His eyes held an easy steadiness, meeting mine directly, unflinching, as though he could sense my surprise, and found it almost amusing. Even the way he spoke carried a natural authority, his deep voice laced with a warmth that made it impossible to feel uneasy around him. There was an effortless charm to the way he smiled, a hint of mischief in his expression, like he was used to drawing people in without even trying. It wasn't arrogance, it was assurance, the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are and being completely comfortable in your own skin. I couldn't help but feel a flicker of nervousness under his gaze, a faint awareness that I was seeing him in a way I never had before. It was unsettling, yet strangely magnetic. "Dylan." "Oh, thank you. I'd appreciate it," I said, my voice more flustered than I intended. He moved closer, placing his hands firmly on the ladder to steady it as I climbed down. When our hands brushed briefly, I felt a jolt, an electric spark that lingered far longer than it should have. I dismissed the thought as I stepped onto the ground, forcing myself to focus on the task at hand. "It's nothing," I told myself firmly, "just a fleeting moment, a trick of nerves from standing on an unstable ladder." But even as I tried to rationalize it, the warmth of his touch lingered, like an echo I couldn't quite silence. "Stop it, Evelyn," I scolded myself. "He's just being polite. Don't make it more than it is." "Mom asked me to drop something off," he said, holding up a small gift bag I hadn't noticed before. His grin was easy and unassuming. "I saw you struggling out here and figured I'd offer a hand. Looked like you could use some help." "That's very kind of you," I replied, leading him to the table where decorations were scattered. As we worked side by side, I couldn't help but notice how effortlessly he moved, how his laughter seemed to light up the air around us. He talked about college, his plans for life, His enthusiasm was infectious, and for the first time in a long while, I felt myself letting go of the constant weight on my shoulders. Each time our hands accidentally touched, I felt a flutter in my chest, a sensation I hadn't felt in years. I told myself it was nothing, just the excitement of the party preparations, but deep down, I knew it was something more. I stole glances at him when he wasn't looking, noticing the way the sunlight caught the angles of his face, the strong line of his jaw, the slight shadow of stubble that added to his maturity, and the way his cheekbones seemed almost sculpted. His dark hair, slightly tousled, fell in a way that framed his face, giving him a casually polished look, as though he hadn't tried, but still managed to look effortlessly put together. His broad shoulders and lean build hinted at strength, his movements fluid and purposeful, yet unhurried, as if he was always at ease with himself. Even his smile, when it appeared, seemed to light up his whole face, reaching his deep-set eyes that held an intriguing mix of warmth and confidence. There was a magnetism about him, subtle but undeniable, that I couldn't ignore. The party itself was lively, with laughter and conversation filling the backyard. Dylan moved easily among the guests, his charisma drawing people to him. The center of every group he joined, I found myself watching him from across the garden, torn between admiration and a growing guilt for even noticing. And then, it happened. His gaze flicked toward me, lingering just a moment longer than necessary. It wasn't an accident. His eyes held a quiet intensity, as if he was reading something I hadn't intended to reveal. When I looked away, flustered, I could still feel the weight of his attention. A few minutes later, as I dared to glance in his direction again, I caught him watching me once more. This time, there was the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his lips, like he knew exactly what he was doing and enjoyed my unease. My breath hitched, and I quickly busied myself with refilling drinks at the table. But even as I poured, I felt the pull of his gaze across the crowd, tempting me to look again, as if some invisible thread connected us. At one point, he approached me at the drinks table, holding a glass. Finally, I thought, a flicker of excitement warming me before I could stop it. He came to me. I couldn't help the small sense of relief and quiet joy that bubbled up, as though I had been waiting for this moment without even realizing it. "Saved this for you, Mrs. Hart," he said softly, his eyes meeting mine with a warmth that made my heart skip. "Thank you, Dylan. I needed this," I replied, our fingers brushing again. That fleeting touch sent another wave of something I couldn't quite name through me. I quickly took a sip of the drink, hoping to hide the blush creeping up my cheeks. As the evening settled and shadows stretched across the garden, we found ourselves in a quieter corner, the glow of string lights casting a soft ambience. Our laughter came easily, the conversation slipping into something more intimate. For the first time, he called me by my first name. "Evelyn," he said, his voice low. "Life here, it can't be all bake sales and gardening, can it?" I laughed nervously, unsure how to respond. Sometimes choosing between two shades of paint feels like the thrill of the year, I joked, though the humor felt hollow. "Maybe you need more excitement in your life," he said, his gaze lingering on me a moment too long. Then, to my surprise, he winked, so quick and subtle that I wasn't entirely sure I hadn't imagined it. Was that a hint? I wondered, my mind racing as warmth crept into my cheeks. Or was he simply being playful? I couldn't tell, and the uncertainty left me both flustered and intrigued. His words unsettled me, not because they were wrong, but because they hit far too close to a truth I wasn't ready to admit. Before I could respond, Ryan's voice cut through the moment, pulling us back to reality. A few days later, I felt restless. The memory of Dylan's words replayed in my mind, their implications gnawing at me. Seeking distraction, I went to the Willow Lane Cafe, my favorite refuge. lounge. As I walked in, the familiar scent of fresh coffee and pastries greeted me, but it was the sight of Dylan sitting at a corner table that stopped me in my tracks. He looked up and smiled. "Evelyn!" What a surprise. I hesitated for a moment, then joined him. Our conversation flowed effortlessly, covering books, dreams, and topics I hadn't discussed with Peter in years. At one point, Dylan leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "You're not what I expected Peter's wife to be." I blinked, startled. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," he said thoughtfully. "Someone more reserved. But you're so alive." His words sent a thrill through me, and I laughed, though my heart raced. I'll take that as a compliment. As I left the cafe that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that Dylan saw something in me I hadn't seen in myself for a long time. The tension between us grew stronger with each encounter. One evening, I called Dylan for help with a computer issue, a flimsy excuse to see him. He arrived quickly, his presence filling the room with an energy I couldn't ignore. As he worked, our shoulders brushed, and that same electric current coursed through me. His closeness was intoxicating, and when our eyes met, it was as if the world around us disappeared. Without thinking, I leaned in, and our lips met in a soft but urgent kiss. When we pulled away, my voice trembled. "We can't do this." I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat making it difficult to breathe, let alone speak. The weight of what had just happened pressed heavily on my chest, and I struggled to steady myself. "I know," he said, his voice equally unsteady. But the fire between us was undeniable, and every touch, every glance only fueled it further. My knees began to tremble, weak under the weight of the desire coursing through me. It was as though my body was betraying me, giving in to feelings I had tried so hard to suppress. A few days later, I attended a small gathering at Mara's house. After a lively dinner, I excused myself to freshen up. Stepping into the guest bathroom, I turned on the shower briefly to mask the noise and gathered my thoughts. There was a soft knock on the door. "Evelyn, are you all right?" Dylan's voice was gentle, concerned. "Yes," I replied, but my voice sounded strained, even to me. "Can I come in?" he asked hesitantly. Before I could refuse, he stepped inside, his presence filling the small room. The soft hum of the shower created a strange intimacy. His eyes searched mine, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, without warning, his hand reached out, brushing a strand of hair from my face. The gesture was so tender, so deliberate, that I felt my breath hitch. "Dylan, we can't," I whispered, but my voice lacked conviction. His hand slid down to cup my cheek, and, before I knew it, his lips were on mine again, this time deeper, filled with a longing that mirrored my own. The steam from the shower wrapped around us, making the moment feel surreal, suspended in time. The warmth of his lips and the steady pressure of his hand on my cheek sent a shiver through me, the kind that had nothing to do with the heat from the steam. For a moment, I forgot where we were, who we were, forgot everything except the way his presence overwhelmed my senses. My heart pounded, every beat echoing in my ears. But as his hand moved down to rest lightly on my arm, the weight of reality began to creep back in. I pulled away, breathless, my chest heaving. The room was quiet except for the steady patter of the shower and the sound of our ragged breathing. "Dylan," I said softly, my voice trembling. It has to stop." He stepped back slightly, his brow furrowed, his eyes searching mine for something. Reassurance maybe, or permission. "I know this is wrong," he admitted, his voice low, barely audible over the water. "But I can't help it. I can't stop thinking about you. You're in my head, Evelyn, all the time." I felt my knees weaken again, the raw honesty in his words cutting through every defense I had left. You don't understand what this could do to me, to you, to everyone. I don't care, he said, his tone more determined now. I mean, I care about you. I care about how you feel, but I can't pretend this isn't real. I've never felt like this about anyone. The intensity in his gaze was almost too much, and I turned away, leaning against the sink for support. My reflection in the mirror startled me. Flushed cheeks, wide eyes, a mix of fear and something far more dangerous, desire. Dylan, we need to leave this here. Whatever this is, it can't follow us out of this room, I said, forcing myself to steady my voice. He stood there for a moment, silent, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. I don't want to hurt you, Evelyn. I mean that. His sincerity was like a dagger, both comforting and cutting at the same time. I know, I whispered, not trusting myself to say more. He moved toward the door, his hand hesitating on the knob. But if you change your mind, if you ever feel the way I feel, I'll be here. He gave me one last look, something between hope and resignation, before stepping out of the bathroom. The silence that followed was deafening. I turned off the shower, the steam dissipating along with the fleeting sense of escape it had provided. The weight of my choices settled on me like a stone. I didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. Dylan had awakened something in me that couldn't be ignored, no matter how much I tried to suppress it. As I stepped out of the bathroom and back into the party, everything felt different. The conversations, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, it was all background noise now, a distant hum in the chaos of my thoughts. Dylan was across the room, speaking to a group of people, but his eyes found mine, just for a moment. And in that fleeting glance, I knew this wasn't over. He had filled me with energy, with longing, with something I couldn't yet name. The weeks that followed were a blur of stolen glances and quiet moments where time seemed to slow down, as though the universe conspired to give us space while the rest of the world kept moving. Dylan lingered in my thoughts, his presence a constant hum in the back of my mind, pulling me toward a line I knew I shouldn't cross. We tried to keep our distance, but it was futile. Every encounter felt charged, every accidental touch igniting something that refused to be extinguished. I began to question everything, my marriage, my choices, even the person I had always believed myself to be. One evening, as twilight settled over the garden, I found him waiting by the old oak tree at the edge of the yard. The glow of the string lights barely reached him, casting his face in shadow, but I could feel the intensity of his gaze. "You can't keep doing this," I said softly, my voice trembling. "Doing what?" he replied, stepping closer. "Evelyn, I'm not the one running away." I crossed my arms, trying to create some barrier between us. "Dylan, this can't go on. It's wrong. It's dangerous." "Then tell me to leave," he said, his voice steady, almost defiant. "Tell me to walk away, and I will. But don't lie to yourself. Don't tell me you don't feel this." The words caught in my throat. I wanted to deny it, to end this once and for all, but the truth weighed heavily on me. I did feel it. Every moment we spent apart only made it stronger. "I can't," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. "But I have to." Dylan exhaled sharply, his frustration palpable. He reached out, his hand brushing mine, and for a moment, I didn't pull away. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me, a reminder of everything I was trying to forget. "I don't want to hurt you, Evelyn," he said, his voice breaking slightly. I don't know how to stop wanting this, wanting you." I looked at him, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, the rawness of his emotions laid bare. it was a mirror of my own. Neither do I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. But I knew what had to happen. That night, I made a decision, not out of fear, but out of love. For myself, for my family, and yes, for Dylan too. This wasn't the life he deserved, nor the path I could allow myself to take. It had to end, no matter how much it hurt. Months passed, and life found its rhythm again. Dylan left town, returning to the city to focus on his future. Mara would mention him, occasionally, her voice full of pride for all he was accomplishing. I would smile and nod, the ache in my chest dull but persistent. Peter and I worked to rebuild what we had lost. There were hard conversations, tears shed, and truths we couldn't ignore. But slowly, piece by piece, we found each other again. Not in the way we had been before, but as something stronger, forged by the trials we had faced. One afternoon, while I was tending to the garden, I found myself thinking of Dylan. The memory of him felt like a distant dream now, bittersweet and fleeting. I touched the petals of a blooming rose and allowed myself a small smile. He had filled me, yes, but not in the way I once thought. He had awakened something within me, a reminder of who I was and what I was capable of feeling. And for that, I would always be grateful. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, Peter stepped outside, a cup of tea in hand. He sat beside me on the bench, his presence warm and steady. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice gentle. I turned to him, the weight of the past finally lifting. "About how far we've come," I said honestly, taking his hand in mine. And as we sat there together, watching the world turn golden in the fading light, I realized I was finally at peace.